Welcome to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. Rabbi Diana Fersko is the senior rabbi at the Village Temple in Manhattan. She served as National Vice President of the Women's Rabbinic Network and is a member of the New York Board of Rabbis. Diana received her rabbinic ordination from Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, where she also earned a master's degree in Hebrew literature. For more than a decade, Rabbi Fersko has been preaching and teaching about anti-Semitism. Her new book, We Need to Talk About Antisemitism, was published in August 2023 and gives us a guide to modern anti-Semitism in its many forms. Welcome, Rabbi Fersko, and thank you for letting me call you Diana. Welcome to the broadcast.
I'm so honored to be here. Thank you for having me.
So this book, I'm sure you've been asked the question before, why another book on anti-Semitism, particularly following Deborah Lipstadt's and Barry Weiss's? Why did you feel like there was a vacuum that needed to be filled?
I actually don't feel like there is a vacuum at all. I look at it more like the way we look at the Passover Seder, where it's a mitzvah to add to the story. And that's what I think I'm doing through the book. I'm talking about the anti-Semitism that I've witnessed and heard about as a congregational rabbi for the past decade or so. And I'm adding to the corpus of Jewish literature about anti-Semitism. And I actually think there needs to be much, much more, especially with what's happening today.
And you were at Stephen Wise Synagogue in New York with Ami Hirsch, Rabbi Ami Hirsch, for many years. I know you had a great partnership. But some of these experiences were kind of seeded at that time, where people were coming to you, as you describe in the book, with complications or difficulties or pressures on their kids on campus, in their progressive spaces. Can you give us a taste of just what was the engine for you actually wanting to respond to what you were hearing?
Sure. So the more you talk about something, the more people talk to you about it. So I was giving sermons about anti-Semitism, and it was not a popular topic at the time. You know, it was before this resurgence was really quite pronounced. And as I kept talking about it, I heard from more and more parents about concerns about what was happening in their child's school, or adults that were having questions about how their workplace was being organized. I heard a lot of anxiety around sending your kid off to college campuses, for example. And I didn't necessarily see those stories reflected in the national discourse about anti-Semitism. And that was frustrating to me as a leader. So I vented my frustration in the most Jewish way possible and wrote a book about it.
And you said, or I know you gave this in a sermon and it's in your book, you, that's us, we're on a pretty good vacation from anti-Semitism. You looked at it, it didn't really look at you. Now you're saying it's looking back. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is, as an elder millennial, I think my childhood was really protected from anti-Semitism. So, yes, we didn't sing a Hebrew song on the bus. That was something like kind of kept inside, or you didn't announce you were Jewish to strangers. But basically, we saw ourselves as completely equal to everyone else. We expected full access to jobs and professional institutions. We weren't worried that our Judaism would ever be an impediment to accessing secular American society. And Judaism was largely something we studied about as if it was a history. So we went to a museum about it. It was about the past. We watched a movie about it, but it wasn't us. It was them. And now it's us, it's teens, it's adults, it's everyone. And we don't have that luxury of considering anti-Semitism a history. Rather, we're having to navigate it on a near daily basis.
And before we leave your childhood, I want to quote you saying, growing up, I lived by unspoken rules about not letting other people know that I was Jewish. I did a kind of performance art of never being too Jewish. I grew up in New York City. That wasn't so much my experience. I wasn't really worried about Hebrew songs on the bus. So give us a sense, a little bit more of the color of your childhood.
Right. So first of all, you can imagine looking at me that's very easy to do. Right, to blend or to pass or to, sometimes I have like the opposite problem where I like to tell people I am Jewish because they don't think I am. But what I'm talking about in that section that you mentioned is that there's, I think, an idea in many places where Jews are a small minority that you don't share your culture, your religion, your identity beyond your family and, in my case, your Jewish community. It was kept there and isolated there, and everywhere else, you just kind of blended in. So people would say, "Where are you from?" For example, very easy, innocuous question. And, my friends would say, "Italy." Most of them were Italian. But I'm Jewish. So I don't know where I'm from. And I'm from many places. And my family's Jewish story is all about immigration and refugeeism and moving. So it's not an easy question. And to tell someone, "Oh, I'm from Russia," but I'm not Russian. I'm Jewish, it is misleading. So that's the sort of maneuvering that I always felt I had to do as a child. And I feel that that's a common experience for us non-native New Yorkers.
So you're saying that we were a little bit having sort of an anti-Semitism nap, and suddenly we have to wake up, and you kind of pin it to 2015 or so when it begins. What starts to happen that you think makes us all have to be alert in a new way in the last, 6-7 years or so?
Sure. One of the turning points was the Nazi march in Charlottesville. I can remember I was sitting at my desk like I am now, and my phone started, buzzing. And it was all of my colleagues like texting me, "Have you seen this?" I was a youngish rabbi when that happened, and I had to give the sermon that week. And I remember thinking, what can I possibly say? I don't understand what a Nazi march is. Like, that's not a thing in the country where I live that I know about. This can't be real, but it was real. And I think when that happened, it woke some people up to the level of increasing anti-Semitism. But unfortunately, it also woke up other bad actors and helped to normalize anti-Jewish behavior amongst anti-Semites.
You write, as of the writing of this book, anti-Semitic incidents in the state where I live, New York, have increased by over 400%. In 2021, the Anti-Defamation League tabulated 2,717 anti-Semitic incidents throughout the United States, marking a 34% increase from 2020. This was the highest number on record since the ADL, that's the Anti-Defamation League, began tracking these incidents in 1979. Those are pretty bracing numbers.
It's heartbreaking. It's hard to comprehend. And it's also the beginning of a conversation. Like, I don't think as a Jewish community, we want to rest on the statistics. Part of what I'm doing in the book is adding that personal layer. Okay, here are the statistics, but here's what that actually means for Jews in our everyday life. Maybe it means that you're tucking in your Jewish star on the subway. Maybe it means that your child is hearing anti-Semitic ideas that you yourself could never have dreamed of. And I think it's very important that we continue to tell our stories with great detail to build compassion and empathy towards the Jewish people.
So the title of your book is "We Need to Talk About Antisemitism." Are we really not talking about it? Like, where are you seeing the silence?
Right. So it's funny. Some people say, like, "Oh, we need to stop talking about anti-Semitism," right? Like, enough already. I get that.
But wait, pause there. You made a joke. But what do you get about that? What do you get about the, like, Dianu? Or Dianu is usually a good thing. Enough already.
Right. It's stressful. It's scary. It is, like I said, hard to wrap your head around that it's happening in urban spaces, in suburban spaces, in red states, blue states, etc. And I think that I understand it's not the only part of Jewish life. Like, You want to talk about all the good things. You want to eat challah. You want to celebrate the holidays. And we should. We should do that a lot. But I actually don't think that we talk about anti-Semitism enough. I think we talk about it in flare-ups. So when something horrific happens, we talk about it for a week, maybe. When a pop star goes on a horrific rant, we talk about it and then we move on. Like everything in the news, it's a very fast cycle. And I'm urging people and just empowering them to let them know, like, even if something is not in the news, you can still bring it up at your kitchen table. And you can still ask your child, how's it going?
I just want to push you, Diana, because I'm sure you've heard many people say that when we overfocus or even just focus on anti-Semitism, it kind of is doubling down on the narrative of Jews as victims. And why aren't we focusing on Jewish literacy, Jewish education, prayer, as you say, celebrations, making challahs, but not just sort of the light stuff, but the deep stuff that is like the reason we want to be Jews, and not so much how other people are defining us. I want you to answer that, because I think that is sometimes people's resistance to not necessarily your book, but this message.
I love that question. I don't see us as victims. I see us as fighters. And that's a very different thing. And that's what this book is about. Fighting for exactly what you're talking about. Fighting for Jewish identity to be accepted in all spaces as an identity. Fighting for inclusion in national conversations about diversity. Fighting for recognition of our history and of who we are as a people, which does include horrific violence, but not only. And I think I'm out there fighting, as so many people are, because Jewish identity is being diminished in many ways, and we're being intimidated. And I don't want to be intimidated by anti-Semites. I want Jews to be able to tell all those stories that you're talking about, right? To talk about who we are and our amazing traditions and teachings freely, publicly, more aggressively, more openly. And that's why we need to talk about it.
You say sometimes we don't talk about anti-Semitism because anti-Semitism is working. Maybe a small part of you, that's the Jewish person, believes it's lies. And I think you're touching on something real there. In terms of kind of internalizing some of this kind of diminishment that you're talking about, or having some kind of stain on Jewish identity. And obviously that's very, I think, connected to the Israel discussion right now, and we can address that because you do in a whole chapter. But just that idea of maybe a small part of you believes it's lies, I want you to kind of flesh that out for us.
Sure. So I think in my experience, Jews are trying to be good people in one way or another, right? We're trying to follow the teachings of Torah. We're trying to be good citizens. We're trying to take responsibility for our own errors, right? We have an entire holiday coming up dedicated to exactly that. And so I think part of what happens is that we accept certain messaging that then leads us to be confused about who we are. So I think sometimes we can tell ourselves things like, well, I am privileged. Look at this wonderful life I lead, and I'm grateful. But the other thing that happens when you say that is that it sometimes unintentionally underscores a trope of anti-Semitism that Jews have access, wealth, power. And I think that is a very complicated space that many Jews are living in right now, like trying to sort out that whole conversation.
And what about in progressive spaces? And you address this obviously on campuses, but also like in workspaces. When there's sort of a DEI training, Jews are often kind of written out of the minority groups. They're just put in the bucket of being white, I'm not going to say privilege, but there's sort of an assumption that you are in the bucket of white Americans. It's obviously a much more complicated story than that. But can you just address where are you seeing this practically be a problem in our lives? Not the flare-up, but the daily kind of injury.
Sure. So I think you're pointing to it in your question. I mean, we've seen it in the workplace more and more, and I've heard similar stories to what you're alluding to in terms of sort of moments of what's been described to me as racial sorting, and how that can be just deeply triggering for, say, for example, the person who told me the story was a third-generation Holocaust survivor. And I think that's part of the reason why we need to fight to tell our stories, because, I believe in the goodness of people. And I believe that so many of these professionals are earnest people working towards making a more just society. And I think there's a lack of understanding of what it means to be Jewish. We often don't fall into the normative buckets that our society is like to classify people by. So we're not one class. We're not one race. We're not, like we come in all shapes and sizes and backgrounds. And so it's very hard to kind of fit Jews in to the narrative in many of those spaces because we don't fit.
You write, if only the Jews would, that's something that you hear a lot, if only the Jews would. And you say, when I look at the outrageous and lengthy history of anti-Semitism, one thing is clear, the Jews won't. The Jews are still here, and God willing, we are not going anywhere. We will not sit silently on the sidelines of civil society while physical hate crimes and emotional bias against us skyrocket. We will not relinquish our customs, our culture, our community, or our voice. We will foreground our Jewish identity. We will take up space. We will have the audacity to claim our identity in cultural settings that ask us to diminish it. Those are strong words. And I think they are a rallying cry. But what is the resistance to that cry? Where are you seeing people actually be like, I don't think so. I'm not with you on the fight in a way?
Well, there are levels, right? So I think that it's not, the resistance is not like, I'm not with you on the fight, but there's a difference between being all in and being checked out. And I would like people to move closer to the all in side of things. And also just awareness, like, Jews live in all different lifestyles. So the way you see anti-Semitism really depends, one, on your generation, which I mentioned, but two, on your engagement with Judaism. So if you're very peripherally engaged in the Jewish world, then you're probably a lot less fluent in the problems of anti-Semitism. So that's part of what I'm hoping the book will inspire, just more engagement with the issue at all.
You and I are talking, and I think maybe the 9th month of the protests in Israel. Obviously, you wrote this book before they really erupted. But when you write about Israel and you say anti-Israel anti-Semitism is the socially acceptable Jew hate of our day, the anti-Semitism en vogue. Talk about that, where you're seeing that play out, and has the controversy around the judiciary in some way changed your perspective now in terms of criticism of Israel?
No, well, what I would say is, before anyone asks me from this conversation, like, read the chapter, read the book, I would say I'm very comfortable with criticism of Israel. I'm comfortable with criticism of everything, that's the way. I have a diverse congregation. I've heard lots of different viewpoints. I can hear it all. I'm a proud Zionist. I don't think anything that's happened with the judicial reform has anything to do with the eternal nature of the relationship of the Jewish people to Israel. No, it hasn't changed.
But in terms of just addressing how it was playing out, put aside judicial reform, how in America you are seeing that anti-Semitism being expressed?
So I think sometimes we can get lost in very high level conversations, and we can forget what it's like for people on the ground. So my real concern is like, okay, but what happens to an 18-year-old? So what I see happening
An 18-year-old here? I just want to clarify.
Yeah,
In
yes.
America?
So an 18-year-old that goes to college in America, where does all of this anti-Israel vitriol, which is different than criticism, right? Vitriol, lead to? And I think it leads to Jewish kids feeling like they can be less Jewish on college campuses. And that's unacceptable to me.
You also address just the ignorance about the Holocaust, the fact that most young people particularly can't name a concentration camp. Obviously, most have not been to a Holocaust museum, think that it's 2 million who died instead of 6, and that you often hear, or you have people tell you they hear, don't even talk to me about the Holocaust. That was so long ago. Jews are doing pretty damn well, or some version of that. So can you just address what I think you call the flat Holocaust? For the majority of Americans, the Holocaust is flat Holocaust. Tell us what you mean by that.
What I mean by flat Holocaust is that we have in our culture this relentless analogizing of the Holocaust. Just on my way to meet you right now, I was listening to a podcast of another author, and she said working at her company was like a death march. But you know what? Working at a company is not like a death march. And it's just increasingly, and when I point it out, you'll hear it more and more, people are comfortable using Holocaust metaphors and analogies to express their own pain. And what happens when you do that casually and consistently is that it simplifies the Holocaust into a synonym for the word bad. Nazi bad, Holocaust bad. That's not what the Holocaust was. It is a complicated, painful, tragic crime against the Jewish people. And I call it flat Holocaust because I think our culture is very comfortable sort of shrinking and simplifying and diminishing Jewish history. And I actually include a testimonial in the book for that exact reason, because to learn about the Holocaust, you need to hear a detailed testimony.
Yeah, that's very shattering. That is very shattering testimony. You also call out the voluntary wearing of yellow stars.
Sure,
as an
that's
example.
The same thing. And you know, it's just shocking and dangerous, because what happens is if we allow the flattening of the Holocaust to continue, eventually you will divorce that tragedy from the Jewish people. And it will just be under a secular, like something bad happened to some people sort of idea in our culture. And I think as Jews, we cannot allow that to happen.
Accountability, your section on accountability. You're speaking to me, to all of us. What's the charge?
Myself. I think that what's happened over time is that there's this like discussion, and it happens with many cultures, including ours, of how do you deal with anti-Semites who you like? How do you deal with anti-Semites who, are repentant or are in public and are unrepentant? And there's this whole conversation about what do you do? And so in the book, I sort of take you through a process for thinking about that. But I also want to point out that, like, for me, I think the Jewish community should have a very big say in how to hold anti-Semites accountable. And right now, I think that some of those decision-making sort of powers are being given to other platforms and other people. And I would be more comfortable if we could have that conversation in our own community.
I just want to clarify. You said anti-Semites we like. So I don't. Yeah. My first instinct is I don't really think I like an anti-Semite, but you're also reminding me that there are people who have views that otherwise align with mine, except for how they perhaps talk about Israel or talk about Jews. Can you give us just a little more on?
For me, it's like, well, what if you're a lifelong Kanye fan? You just love his music. You listen to him all the time. He's in your headphones. You had some of your favorite memories to his music. And now he says these horrific, offensive things. How do you reconcile that? Do you let your child play Kanye at their bar mitzvah? I had a parent who said, and this is another case of an athlete who supported an anti-Semitic documentary. Do you let your child wear that athlete's jersey to school? I'm not a big cancel person, so that's not my answer. But for people that don't repent and aren't sorry, no. I'm done with Kanye. I'm good. I like other people better.
So finally, the future, Diana. You say if you are Jewish and want to fight anti-Semitism, do something Jewish. Anything. Consider public pride in your Judaism as an act of defiance. Go out into this world and wear your Jewish star necklace, show off your Chai tattoo, wave your Israeli flag, and put that menorah in your window for all to see. Give us a sense of why these gestures or this kind of public pride you think will actually make a difference.
It's so easy for Jews to fly under the radar and to participate in civic life as people, but never share anything about who they are religiously. And for non-Orthodox Jews, obviously. So I think that it makes a huge difference to let your coworkers know, to model for your children that actually Jewish identity is not something that should live in the closet. It's something that we as Americans should be able to exercise, be proud of, be relaxed about sharing in our everyday lives, because we cannot fight this hate alone. We need allies, we need friends, we need upstanders. And I think being Jewish outwardly, publicly, proudly is the unlock to all of that.
And are you scared, Diana? I mean, is that actually a feeling you're aware of? Or more scared than you've been? Is there a sense of actual fear?
I feel so torn answering that. I feel like there's one way I need to be in public, and then there's one way I am inside. And the real answer is yes, I am scared.
Thank you. Rabbi Diana Fersko, thank you for this book. The name is We Need to Talk About Antisemitism. It is out as of August 2023. Thank you for joining us on In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. See you next time.